Hi everybody, this is Professor Smitherman Brown. I'm here to provide some notes about Chapter 1. So welcome to the material for the course. Hopefully by now you have the textbook, you have read through the introductory materials within Canvas, and are feeling pretty good about the course and the direction that it's heading. Of course, you can always email me and send me any questions that you have, but just as a reminder, I will provide some narration of the slides every week, and so I'll start that with week 1 today. Just keep in mind that the slides for Chapter 1 are pretty lengthy, so there's something like 60-something slides. Most of them are images from the chapter. I won't go through everything, but I will hit the highlights for the chapter, and I will give you a sample of the kind of analysis I'm looking for and your understanding of each one of the chapters. This is probably going to end up being a pretty lengthy YouTube video that I will link to our Canvas site. Feel free to pause, take it in chunks. I'm probably just going to upload the entire thing if I'm able to, but I do know that it's going to be a pretty long thing, so take what you need for it. You can also navigate through the slides on your own if you prefer not to listen to my voiceover narration, and that's perfectly fine as well. So just to get started here, as a reminder, we are in Sayers' Discovering the Humanities, Chapter 1, The Prehistoric Past and the Earliest Civilizations. So remember that for each one of the chapters, there's a set of learning goals. These are posted in Canvas. They are also on one of the opening pages for the chapter, and it's a really good idea to review these just to have an understanding of the main ideas from each chapter. If you can make it through each one of the learning goals, you should be in pretty good shape as you're thinking about studying for our first unit exam in the course, which will happen in about 3 weeks. So we begin here with prehistoric cultures, and Chapter 1 is sort of split up so that we'll be covering prehistoric cultures, the first civilization that we know of, which is in Mesopotamia, and then we'll talk about ancient Egyptian culture as well. So we'll start here with prehistoric period. So first, just some terms to know. One, what do we mean by prehistoric? That just means very basically prehistory. So we're talking about a time period in which people do not have the tools that they need to write down history. So this is largely an era that we know about based on oral culture. So people are telling one another stories, and those stories get passed down generation to generation, and eventually, once people have developed a system of writing, someone writes them down and we know about them here. But largely, what we know about this period, because they aren't keeping journals to tell us why they're making cave paintings and small sculptures, it's a lot of speculation. We're doing our best to sort of guess based on the material that we have. So know that right up front. Second term to know, what is a myth? This is a really loaded term. Oftentimes we talk about myths as things that we assume to be false, and I want you to be careful of talking about myth in that way in terms of this course, because very much so a myth in this class is just a story that a culture tells itself in order to explain things that are otherwise unexplainable. So even though many of these myths we know are untrue today, what's important to remember is that at one particular time, a group of people at a certain time period did absolutely believe the myth, or at the very least were okay with using it as a story to explain something within the culture. So, for example, when we get to Egyptian culture deals very much with life along the Nile River, and one of the things that the Nile River does every year is flood. And when the floodwaters recede, it leaves this wonderful silt deposit that makes the land very fertile, so they have lots of great crops. But people begin to wonder why it is that the riverbanks overflow at a certain time of the year, that there's a flood, and because they don't have the science to understand it back in prehistoric times, or in ancient times, they make stories about gods, and there must be a god of the Nile River who causes it to flood every year. So this is an example of myth not in the negative term that it's false, but in that it is a story that people tell themselves in order to explain really complex things like, why does nature work in the way that it does? Where do humans come from? How was the world created? And so it's important that we don't use this term in a negative connotation, because really every religious system that exists has a way of explaining many of these things. So all of the major religions of the world use myth as stories of our own origins. Where did people come from? Why are we here? What is our purpose? And those explanations become the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And then lastly, culture. Culture refers to lots of things, but for the purpose of this course, it's going to refer to specifically the things that people produce that help us to define a group of people. So a large part of what we do in this course is we look at the items that people produce in terms of art or tools or clothing or food or buildings, literature, music, etc., and we figure out what we can know about those people who produced it. So two of the earliest cultures that we'll look at is Paleolithic and Neolithic. That Neolithic should say New Stone Age, and Paleolithic is the Old Stone Age. So perhaps you've heard of the paleo diet, which is a really popular fad diet right now. If you're on the paleo diet, you're encouraged to eat things that Paleolithic people ate. And that's because they were hunter-gatherers. They did not have a stable civilization as of yet. These were people who roamed. They were nomadic. They moved along with the animals that they hunted. So as bison and other animals were migrating, they would follow right along with them. And so their food basically consists of animals that were readily available and hunted in the wild, nuts, which would grow wildly, and any kind of fruit or vegetable that's wild growing. It would not include things that you had to cultivate by having a farm, such as grains, wheats, and even the paleo diet omits having any type of dairy or beef products, because those are products that are that come about through civilization. So the Paleolithic era is also known for making tools, small weapons, and small sculptural objects. So these are the type of things we have from this Paleolithic period. What replaces the Paleolithic era is the Neolithic era, and what we begin to look at here is agriculture in particular as being a replacement for hunting and gathering. So people actually begin to be more stable and stay in one location, and then begin to domesticate animals like cows and begin to cultivate the land. So they begin to grow crops instead of just finding things that grow wildly. We also begin to see stable architecture made from more durable materials such as stone, instead of what the Paleolithic people used, which was very much typically just animal bones and animal hide as a sort of nomadic temporary shelter. So one of the first artifacts that we have from the Paleolithic period are cave paintings. And there's a couple of caves that are especially famous for their paintings, and you can Google these and find lots and lots of videos and tours of the cave if you want to see more images and you're interested in this. The one that we're going to look at is Chauvet Cave in France. There's another one in France called Laussel Cave, and both of these are famous for their Paleolithic cave paintings. So it's important as we go through each one of the slides to note a title, if you will. Most of these early titles are just descriptions. So this one, for example, is wall painting with horses. The style is Paleolithic, or the style can also refer to era, but later on it's going to refer to artistic style. And often you'll be asked to identify a work of art by its artist as well, but of course in this early prehistoric period there are no artists that are associated with this. So a few things about the cave paintings, or caves in general. Most archaeologists agree now that there was no such thing as caveman as we see them depicted on television, that people did not actually live in caves. Instead, they used caves probably for ceremonies or sacred sites. And so these images that are found on the wall, and these are pretty common in these caves in France, there's a couple of theories as to why they might have been used. Or why they might have been created. Most commonly, it's believed that they were used as a sort of pre-hunting ritual in which a person would draw an image of the object that they hope to conquer and kill out during the hunt. So here we have some bison, there's a rhinoceros, so right down here are the bison, there's a rhinoceros right in here, and then we have 4 horses as well. There are also other cave paintings that show instruction for hunting. So this could have been basically a list of the type of animals that were available in the area and ways in which to hunt them. The ones at Lascaux seem to have some instructions for hunting bison and the appropriate area to spear a bison to take them down for the kill. But for the most part, these are thought to be just depictions of the hunt and to be related to the hunt. So in that way, this might have been used as a ritual space in order to express agency, to express one's sort of wish fulfillment, to depict the thing that they hope to go out and conquer during the hunt. So a couple of art terms for us to know: modeling and naturalism. So naturalism is an opposite to this other term, abstraction, which we'll get to later on. But naturalism is the intent of the artist to try to make an object as it appears in reality. So to give it some natural look to it. And just to kind of show you the opposite, here we go. Here is abstraction. This is actually a much, much later painting. This is by Susan Rothenberg from the 1970s, where she does a depiction of a horse that's possibly a reference to these earlier cave paintings, but this is a great example of abstraction. So the artist in 1970s has a great developed skill, makes the conscious choice to depict only pieces of this horse. So arguably, this is much less skilled, even though, it's only about 4 decades old, than something like this. So this has more of a natural look to it. One of the ways that whoever painted this or whoever drew this would have achieved this kind of naturalism is through modeling. So modeling, and we'll look specifically at the 4 horses here. One, the 4 horses are kind of layered on top of one another, giving the idea of a 3-dimensional space. So we have this idea of one horse in the background, and then each one sort of staggering in front of the horse in the back. So that's one way to achieve naturalism. Another is through the shading that we see along the head. So take this back horse, for example. We can kind of see the shading that happens along the jawline, and this really kind of helps to create some depth here in the composition, and we get a sense of like the cheekbone curving underneath. So that's what we refer to as modeling. We're modeling in the way that light and shadow reflect on the face to make it look like a 3-dimensional object on a 2-dimensional space, of course. So this is just the region, by the way, of where these caves are located, and all of these little red dots mark major Paleolithic caves in both France and in modern day Spain. So we have Altamira here in Spain. We're looking right in this region right here at Chauvet, but of course here is Lascaux, which is another famous cave area as well. So if you wanted to look up either of those, you can find lots of great resources online, and there's been a couple of documentaries about these as well. So here's that detail again where you can really get a sense of the shading, the different markings of the horses, and the way that they've been modeled in this 3-dimensional realm here. and then Rothenberg again. Here's one that's actually from Laussel. So this is that other cave. This is the one I was referencing earlier, where there are some instructions, it seems, on how one might take down this bison. So this is a wall painting with a bird-headed man. So we have a man here who has a bird head, a bison, and then somewhere else on the wall space there is a rhinoceros, but we don't see that in the picture plane here. Also Paleolithic, dates from around 15,000 and 13,000 BCE, paint on limestone like the other one. And notice in this one, so here is thought to be a spear that has a carving of a bird on the top. So we have the bird-headed man, the bird-headed spear, this idea that this belongs to this person. And then what seems to be a sort of trajectory here showing exactly where you would enter the spear. So up through the belly here, and then we have this opening and the entrails or the guts of the bison are kind of spilling out. So this seems to be the kill shot, if you will. So notice here as well, we have some attempts at naturalism. We've got a reference to the hair of the bison, or we have this attempt to draw the entrails of the bison. There's some shading that's going along here, and yet the human figure is extremely abstract, almost stick figure-ish here. So certainly there seems to be an emphasis on making the animals more natural, but leaving the human figures more abstract. So we're not trying to capture the likeness of a human figure at all. That's not the purpose here. So the purpose was either ceremonial or instructional. So also from the Paleolithic period, in addition to the cave paintings, which is what's really known, that period is really known for, there's also evidence of these small sculptures. This is the Venus of Willendorf, and she's called the Venus of Willendorf because she was found in Willendorf, Austria. And Venus was typically the name. It's a reference to the Roman goddess, but that was the name that was often given to any depiction of a nude woman. She was called a Venus because for a long time, the only time that you should ever see a woman depicted in the nude in art is if she was the Roman goddess of love, Venus. Now she's typically referred to as the woman of Willendorf. So this dates back to about 25,000 to 20,000 BCE, also made out of limestone, the same material that the caves are made out of. Really small figurine here. This only measures to be about 4 inches. So interestingly enough, in this area where the Venus of Willendorf was found, there are lots of female figurines that are found, lots of small statuettes such as this, which really sort of suggests that this is a culture that is either matrilineal or matrilocal, meaning essentially that matrilineal, one's line, one's heritage is kind of passed down through the mother, instead of in our society we have a patrilineal society where your heritage, your name, your sort of ancestry is passed down through the father's side of the family. So this suggests that perhaps it was the opposite, where your ancestry is passed down from the mother's side of the family. It also suggests that women play a very important role in society. So matrilocal culture, a culture in which women are some of the most important figures within that society. What might be the purpose of a figurine such as this? Well, we know essentially that it was colored red, and that's been suggested to sort of represent the menses, or, the fertility cycle of women. And certainly in the figurine, we don't have a depiction of the face. The face is kind of abstracted, but we do see small arms here that are kind of covering over or resting on top of very large distended breast. She has a very large distended abdomen, as well as pronounced genitalia, and this all suggests that this is a fertility token or a fertility figure in some way. So the figurine of a pregnant woman. So this was perhaps, it's very small, could fit within the palm of your hand. This is perhaps a figurine that would have been used as a sort of fertility token or a reference to a fertility goddess. Here's another one just to kind of give you a sense of the multiple depictions of women that were discovered from this period. And I want to take this opportunity just to show you something about sculpture, which is sculpture in the round versus a relief sculpture. So Venus of Willendorf is sculpture in the round. This means that the sculpture is carved out 360 degrees. You can rotate it in all directions and it's completely carved out. Not a sculpture in the round is this one, woman holding an animal horn. This is called a relief sculpture. So in this type of sculpture, you have the figure of the woman that is carved into this background here, and she seems to sort of come forward. So you have just a little bit of a carving away of the stone behind her, but she's not carved out completely 360 degrees. So the back of this surface would be completely flat. So this is called a relief sculpture. Relief sculptures can be a low relief. This one's about medium relief, so we can definitely see a good outline of the body here. There's very deep relief sculptures where you would have almost a three-dimensional shape that's coming forward from the background. And then later on in Egyptian culture, we will see a reverse relief where the carving is actually into the back of the stone. All right. So following the Paleolithic period and the Neolithic period, we begin to see the emergence of these great river valley civilizations. So once people transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic and they start cultivating crops and they start doing more long-range hunting instead of following the herd wherever it's going, we begin to see more stable housing. We begin to see people stay put in one particular area. Where we tend to see the earliest civilizations crop up is right along the major rivers that you see here in this map. So we've got the Nile River, and along there we'll see the ancient civilization of Egypt. Along the Tigris-Euphrates, we'll see one of the first, which is ancient Mesopotamia and Babylonia. The Indus-Ganges River, and then also the Yellow River. We're not going to look at civilizations from these two, but we will take a look at both of these as examples of early river civilizations. So why might people settle along rivers? Well, certainly you have a good source for irrigation, so that helps with the crops, but you also have the use of the rivers for a different kind of hunting. So there's fish, there's bird life, there's all sorts of animals that you might find using the river as well for a food source. So it opens that up, but also transportation. We begin to see things like dugout canoes being used to transport goods pretty locally, and then pretty soon after this, we're going to begin to see the first trade that happens with other civilizations. All right. Oh, so let me go back here. So here's an example. Well, skipping ahead. Here's an example of this area in Turkey, Çatalhöyu, which is one of the first civilizations that we know of. This is another one of these female figures, and this time we have this robust female figure who's seated between two felines, two cat-like animals. So again, it references this idea that perhaps these earlier civilizations were much more matriarchal than today's standards, where we have more of a patriarchy. So we very often see figures. In this case, we have a female figure who is seated on a throne-like type of structure here. So she looks to be in some position of power. The head's a little bit different colored. This was a modern addition, so this is not original to this sculpture. Here we have a reconstruction of a shrine from the same area in modern-day Turkey. And this is still technically in the Neolithic era, but one of the things that begins to happen in the Neolithic era, as I've already suggested, is that people begin to stay put in one area, plant crops, hunt, do more long-range hunting where they go out for a period of days, but then come back to home base. And at home base, we begin to see the building of more stable structures. So this is a shrine from this area. It's made of stone, as you can see here, and we can see some of the elements that would have been found within the shrine. So some evidence that we've moved into the Neolithic era by this point, and notice that the dates are a little bit later, would be that we begin to see things that people collect. This is some sort of icon here where the head is missing, but these would be things that were inside of this kind of structure that's being built, so more stable structure as well. We also begin to see in the Neolithic period the invention of pottery. So this is a piece of pottery from modern day southwestern Iran. It's a beaker. It features this animal known as the ibex with the really long horns here. Dogs featured here. So we've got dogs up in this band running. And then right up here at the top, you've got this long-necked bird. So you can see the little body here and the really long neck. So we get a really stylized version of what animal life would have been like during the period. So we can tell a lot from this. One of the more interesting things, though, when we begin to see pottery, we know that we've moved into a Neolithic era where people are beginning to stay put, because pottery is something that you would need if you were leaving your home, going down to the nearby river, collecting water, and bringing it back to the source. You would also need this for the storage of food in your home. Whereas in the earlier Paleolithic period, you would just be roaming and collecting supplies as you were going. There was no real need to kind of like store and hoard things, because you're always on the move with animals, and animals are always moving according to a water source. So it's also interesting to note that by 3000 BCE, the first potter's wheel was in use in the Middle East and in China, and this is considered to be the very first mechanical and technological breakthrough in history. So the first time that we have a machine that does man's work for them in creating pottery and these type of vessels that could be used. So we're going to talk a little bit about large stone circles, the most famous of which is probably Stonehenge, which we'll take a look at. But notice that there's a lot of different types of stone structures that have always been pretty curious to people. This is an example of menhir alignments, and menhir, this term right here, is basically the term that's used to describe single megaliths that are put in rows like this. So this is just an example of these giant monumental stone pieces called megaliths, just put in rows. So there's a lot of opinions about what this was. This is located in France. And many people think that it was some sort of ancient calendar system. So not a lot of information known about this one. Then we begin to see in the Neolithic people the dolmen. So a dolmen is where you might have a couple of these menhirs, or in this case you've got about 3, almost 4 menhirs that are put together, and they're topped with this capstone on top of them. So this is a dolmen, and this one likely marks a burial chamber. So initially this would have been completely covered with an earthen mound, but as time has passed and some of the earth has eroded, that's come down. So this might have been the structure that held up this earthen mound that made a burial chamber. So the basic construction of what we're going to look at next is this post and lintel construction, where you basically would have 2 of these large megaliths topped by one on top. So these are your posts, the 2 on the side that are parallel to one another, and then the lintel is the piece that is parallel to the ground and perpendicular to the post. And that's the basic structure of Stonehenge. So you can kind of see this is what Stonehenge looks like today. So it's in ruins, although I have an image of an reconstructed Stonehenge. You basically have this post and lintel system where you have the post here capped by these lintels. And this is called a cromlech. So a cromlech it means circle place. This is where you've taken the structure. So menhir was 1, dolmen was where you had 1 or 2, but you have basically the post and then the lintel that tops it. Now you have this continuous post and lintel structure until it would have made an entire circle. So here's an image of what it might have looked like when it was reconstructed. And there's a couple of interesting things that we know about Stonehenge, and they're always coming up with new facts about Stonehenge. So the theories change all the time. There's things in the news about the theories changing. So in this view of Stonehenge, notice that you've got these other outcroppings that seem to be directed in a certain way. This was definitely set up so that it referenced the summer solstice. On the summer solstice, the longest day of every year, we experience it usually in June. As the sun would rise, it would line up with all of these stones here and shine right into the center of Stonehenge. So for a long time, people thought that this was probably some sort of calendar that helped people to know when the middle of summer was, and then they could plan their crop schedule according to that. There's been more recent discoveries of human bones in the area, and so now there's a newer idea that perhaps this is a burial ground. Okay, so just the end of this little section, it talks about myth and talks about creation myths in general. And I would encourage you to take a look at that section of the chapter and have some examples of a creation myth. So a creation myth is basically sometimes it's called an emergence tale. It's the story that people tell themselves about where they came from. So think about the creation story from Christianity and Judaism, but then also I would certainly look at these stories from the Anasazi people, and the Zuni people, the San people, and even Japan's Shinto religion. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here going through this, but I would definitely have a couple of examples of this type of creation myth. And we're going to skip this part, and we're going to jump right to Mesopotamia. So one of the very earliest civilizations is Mesopotamia. So this is a region in the modern day Middle East that we're going to look at. And it's one of the most developed societies that we have from this early period. So this is that civilization that builds up along the Tigris and Euphrates River. So these are twin rivers. So you can see the Euphrates right down below, above it the Tigris River. And Mesopotamia kind of settles up right in between the two. Really nice fertile area. This is sometimes referred to as the Fertile Crescent. But if you look at the areas around, this is around modern day Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey to the northwest. And then here's the Nile River. The Egyptian civilization is going to develop right around in here. So a couple of things to look at here. We're going to be dealing with Mesopotamia, but Mesopotamia is the name for this general region. And we're going to look at a couple of periods within this region. Sumer, and within Sumer we're going to talk about as one of the capital cities. Then we'll also talk about the Akkadian period. So Akkad is up here and they move into this region. We'll talk about the Assyrian period as well as the Babylonian period. And so they're all kind of shown here within this region. So let's just sort of set the scene of what happens once we begin to see really a civilization here. So now we've moved out of the Paleolithic period, out of the Neolithic period, to where we're really talking about one of the first periods of history. So there's going to be the development of writing within this first civilization, and so we begin to have some record keeping. So within Mesopotamia, certainly the people are dependent upon rivers for their livelihood. So they're using it as irrigation for their crops. And as they get better and better at establishing crops, they begin to have excess crops. And once you have extra stuff that you've grown, you can begin to trade it with your neighbor. So they also use their excess crops to make beer for the first time. So there's evidence of that as well. So as there's more food production, there's a general feeling of wealth and stability. There's additional offspring. And so we begin to see the region grow and the civilization grow in this manner. We know that people in Mesopotamia traded by boat for things like stone and wood and metals that would not have been readily available in their area. The period that we're talking about is defined by advances in agriculture and also advances in metallurgy. So this spawns what is known as the Bronze Age, where bronze is made from copper, and this helps, of course, to transform military and warfare adventures, because now there are weapons that are not just made out of sticks and stones, but are actually made out of more durable materials. The greatest innovation of this period, of course, writing, because we begin to see record keeping. And for the most part, record keeping begins just as a way of keeping track with trade. So once you start trading with your neighbors, you need to know how much you're trading and how often you're trading. And so that really becomes the first reason why people begin to develop a system for keeping track of that. In terms of government, we're going to be looking at city-states where the governments are based in urban centers, and those urban centers control some of the neighboring regions. So we see self-governing cities, and they're typically governed in part by the priest king. So there's a real mixing of church and state during this period. The priest king would be a government leader who also acted as an intermediary between the gods and people. So this person would establish laws, and they're establishing laws on behalf of God, or whatever gods that they're using, and passing them down to the people. So Uruk is the name of the oldest settlement from this period. Ur is the best preserved, and so we're going to be looking primarily at the city of Ur. So real quick, a timeline of this area, because there's lots of residents in this area in the Near East. So we are going to be dealing with Sumer for a while. The Akkadians come in and take over for a little bit. There's a period, the Babylonian period. Then we have the Assyrian period, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian. Notice that running concordant to all of this is the civilization that's occupied by the Hebrews. The Hebrews, of course, are the predecessors to Judaism and to Christianity. So they're running along the same path here. So we're going to look at our first piece of architecture, and we get that, or not our first piece, we looked at that shrine just a few slides ago. But here in Sumerian Ur, we have what's known as the ziggurat. The ziggurat is similar to a pyramid, but instead of having straight sides, it has like this sort of like successive platforms that are stacked on top of one another and gradually get smaller and smaller. There's also an outside staircase and a shrine that's located at the top. So I'll just show you what that looks like real quick, and then we'll come back. So here is a view of the ziggurat at Ur. So this is in modern-day Iraq. It was discovered in 1927 by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. So the style here is Sumerian, or you can just put Mesopotamia when you get this as a slide ID. Here's another drawing of what the ziggurat would have looked like fully constructed. So again, we have these successive platforms and then these outside staircases that take us up. This would have been the shrine area right here. And the shrine likely was not open to the public. It likely was reserved for the priest king and people pretty high up. So to go back here, what type of religion are we dealing with? In Mesopotamia, for large part, this is a polytheistic religion, as many of the earliest religions are. So polytheism is the belief in multiple gods, and many of these gods are connected to forces of nature. So remember, returning back to myth, if a myth is a story that we tell ourselves about things that we can't explain right away, one of the ways that we do that is by creating a system of gods that help to explain stuff. So especially in these early civilizations, these polytheistic religions, the gods were very often associated with things like the sun. So there would be a sun god. There would be a god of the water. There would be a god of the storm, the god of fertility and the earth. And every time something happened, so say, for example, it was a really hot year and there's not a lot of water for the crops and a lot of crops die, people would explain that situation by saying that the god of the sun must be upset. And so he is scorching the earth. Religion very much in this early civilization is central. Human beings are seen as sort of this larger society of the universe governed by the gods. And so very much, as I've already mentioned, there's no separation of church and state. The gods sort of order all of life and what is happening. So going back. So what's in the shrine? So I mentioned that probably not everyone had access to the shrine. Only the priest king and others who were high-ranking officials would probably have access to the shrine at the top of these ziggurats. And one of the things that has been found inside of these type of shrines are these dedicatory statues. So this is one from a similar temple in Iraq. And these are statues that people would take to the top of the shrine. Typically, one would go up to the top of the shrine to leave offerings for the gods. But sometimes they would leave these prayer statues. So they were meant to sort of represent, the person who left it there. So because they couldn't be there all the time, they would leave one of these statues in like this perpetual state of prayer towards the gods. So a few things then about them. Their eyes are always really wide open. You can see they're always awake, always present there. Their hands are clasped in this gesture of prayer. And we can tell a fair amount of things about the style of dress, the style of facial hair that would have been worn, the sort of headdresses that would have been worn from the period. Originally, the eyes here would have been inlaid with lapis lazuli, which is this really bright blue stone. So these would have been left, and many of these are left over. So these range in different heights. The tallest one back here is about 30 inches high. So these are not really big, and likely this size, the bigger ones sort of represent higher up officials, whereas the smaller seated ones would be lower ranking officials. So moving on to the next artifact, this is called the Royal Standard of Ur, and it's a two-sided box is what it is. So we're looking at one side, and some people think that the box may have been used as a pillow. We don't really know. It could have been used just as storytelling, but it's two-sided. We're looking at the side here called War, and then the opposite side seen here is called Peace. So one side is war, one side is peace. We'll go back to the war side. So this was found in a tomb in Ur. It's Sumerian as well. It's pretty small, so the entire length of this is less than 2 feet. The height is less than 1 foot. And I just want to kind of talk you through a couple of terms that we should know. So one, this is made up of 3 registers. A register is basically this main piece right here going across. So this is the bottom register, here's the middle register, here's the top register. So that's just the space that the figures occupy. The ground line is the line on which each of the characters is standing. So you can kind of see that the wheels, the horses, the feet of people, they're all sort of organized based on this ground line. And then finally, this social perspective or hieratic scale, it's often called. This is this idea that the largest figures in the composition are the most important figures in the composition. So it's really handy because we can tell right away who's in charge here. It's probably this figure right here at the top register. His head actually breaks through this top part of the register here, and so he's very much the largest figure, the most important figure. So we don't have to do a lot of guesswork as to who's in charge. So this is a scene of war, and we have here this lead figure with his staff. He's leading the people. Behind him, there are soldiers, there's chariots, people with swords here, archmen here. We've got more chariots down at the bottom. And then notice down here at the very bottom, you have the enemy, bodies of the enemy that are kind of being just run over by these charioteers. And we also have some enemy figures here as well coming into combat. So this is a scene of war from the period. And then the opposite of that is this scene of peace. So two sides of the coin. The suggestion here is that it takes times of war to gain times of peace, and we can appreciate times of peace because inevitably there might be times of war. This is one of the earliest examples of a historical narrative. This idea that this is telling a story about a wartime and then the peacetime that follows after. So some of the things that are associated with peacetime then, again, we see if you can kind of look and check out that hieratic scale and figure out who the most important person is in the composition. It's likely this figure here, who again, his head is kind of taller than everybody else's. It's breaking out of the register here. And so we've got the central figure and then other things that might be associated with times of peace: banqueting, fine dining, drinking wine. You have a musician here with a lyre. You've got an abundance of animals that are being brought, perhaps for sacrifice, perhaps just talking about the cultivation of animals. You've got men who are carrying grain and wheat on their backs, so they're very prosperous in terms of their crops. All of these are sort of indicators of good times, times of peace. There's wealth, there's abundance, there's fraternizing, there's music, all of these things that are associated with peaceful civilizations. So we've been talking about Sumer, the Sumerian I don't want you to get too bogged down in worrying about the difference between Sumerians and Akkadians and Assyrians and Babylonians. They're all occupying this area we will call Mesopotamia. But just for the sake of knowledge, around 2300 BCE, Sargon I comes in, and he is leading the Akkadians, who are a little bit north of the Sumer region, and they spread out and they conquer all other cities in Mesopotamia. So they take over this entire region. He calls himself king of the four quarters of the world, and very much equated himself with the gods. And this is a status that all future rulers would take up until the ancient Greek civilization, the Egyptian civilization, Roman civilization. There becomes a real strong habit of having rulers associate themselves with the gods in order to sort of say, my right to the throne has been sanctioned and ordained by the gods. So also with this figure, Sargon I, we have some clay tablets that survive, and clay tablets are the form of the very first writing. So they have like a sort of stylus where they carve these images known as cuneiform. They begin as sort of like little pictographs. They carve them on the clay tablets. And we have from one of these earliest clay tablets a story about Sargon I's birth and his early childhood. And this becomes this kind of narrative genre that we see repeated over and over and over again with various rulers or prominent figures in various civilizations. So we call this the rags to riches story. So it begins by talking about Sargon I being abandoned by parents and found, very often these figures are found like by the riverside, because the river plays such an important part in civilization, and it's sort of the source of all great things, including great rulers. So abandoned by parents, found by the riverside, as an orphan, talks about his orphanhood, and then foster parents who eventually take this person on, and he grows to be this great ruler. So that is this typical story that we have in several civilizations. So Akkadians are originally peaceful with Sumer, and if we go back to that timeline that I showed earlier, Akkadians and Sumerians are living right alongside one another. In fact, Akkadians adopt the culture and customs of the Sumerians, including their style of writing, which we call cuneiform. The only thing that's really different is their language. The Akkadian language is quite different from the Sumerian language, the spoken language that is, and that's the one that becomes the common language of Mesopotamia. There's very few artifacts that survive from the Akkadian period. One of them that does is this mask here. So this is the head of an Akkadian man. This is thought to be Naram-Sin, who is Sargon I's grandson. And this was created using this technique called lost wax casting. So this is made from bronze, and you can see a lot of natural detail here in the hairline, the headwear, the openings for the eyes, the carving of the nose, the lips, and then how stylized the beard looks here. So lots of detail here in this early artifact. This is a model of how the lost wax casting works. So a positive model, so something that was going to look like the finished product, is made with clay, and it's used to make this negative mold. So first you make the thing in hard clay, then you make an indenture of it that makes sort of this negative space that you can then fill with the metal rods, and you can also pour this molten metal material into it. So once that's done, then you kind of break the whole thing away, and then you're left with this mask, which we have. That's pretty much it for them. So after the Akkadians rule for just about 150 years, and during this period, there's 400 separate city-states. So this is an area where everyone is really kind of doing their own thing. Everyone has a different city-state, a different government, just lots of variance in what's happening in Mesopotamia. And then in the 18th century BCE, you have Hammurabi of Babylon, who gains control of the region, and one of the first things that he does is insist on the region coming back together, and so he imposes order, gets everybody back on the same page, and he does so with his law code. So we refer to this as the law code of Hammurabi. This is the first time that we have a clear written law for all the people. It's not subjective, but rather is a clearly stated objective and impartial law. Although some of the different laws that you'll see in Hammurabi's law code create some class distinctions. So this is called a stele. And a stele is basically this large oval-shaped boulder, and these would have, it sort of serves as kind of like a road sign or a monument sign today. These would be placed throughout Mesopotamia, and it has an inscription here on these little registers that go down, and all of these inscriptions make up Hammurabi's law code. So this is the stele of Hammurabi. This is one that was found in modern Shush, Iran, and this is about 7 foot tall. The height, or the dimensions this way, is about a little over 2 feet wide. And again, the inscription is the law code of Hammurabi. So this was one way of getting the word out to all the people in the region that we're united under this new law code. Up here at the top of the stele is this depiction of Hammurabi, and he's being handed this scroll by this god Shamash. And Shamash is one of the chief gods of the region. He's seated on a throne here, and so it's as though to suggest that Hammurabi received this law code from the gods himself, and so the gods definitely want the people to follow it. Here's just a quick example of the kind of things that would have been in this law code. So if a woman is not circumspect but is wayward, squanders her household possessions, and disparages her husband, they shall cast that woman into the water. If a child should strike his father, they shall cut off his hand. If an Awilu should blind the eye of another Awilu, they shall blind his eye. And this is a class of a person. There were some harsher penalties. So this is sort of like a lower to middle class person. If you blind the eye of another lower to middle class person, they're just going to blind your eye. If a lower class person were to blind the eye of an upper class person, that person would then be put to death. So lots of really kind of harsh punishments here. This kind of gives us this concept of an eye for an eye. The idea is that if you do something that causes harm, you will be punished, oftentimes with your own life. Following the Akkadian and Babylonian empires is the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians began to use art as a sort of propaganda. They used art to celebrate the kingdom's achievements. They saw how successful Hammurabi was with his steles of suggesting that this law code was handed right down from the god Shamash. And they began to also use visual elements to get these kind of ideas across to people as well. The Assyrians have iron weapons, so this makes them one of the most militant civilizations in ancient Mesopotamia. And they also have a lot of power in conquering other people, but they use this power as well to preserve culture. So, for example, they are one of the first civilizations to create a library that houses works of literature that want to be preserved for centuries to come. And one of those is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the very oldest literary works that we know of. It's 2,900 lines of Akkadian cuneiform script. So remember that the Akkadians give the Mesopotamian region their language. And it's composed on 11 different clay tablets. It's believed to have been composed as early as 1200 BCE, and it details the life of Gilgamesh, who is this fourth king of Uruk in Samaria. Gilgamesh was said to be 2/3 part god, 1/3 part human, and he's really kind of starts off as being this really bad ruler. He's a real jerk in a lot of ways. He kind of takes whatever women he wants to have, even if they're women who belong to other men or are married to other men. And he really is kind of oppressive in his rule of this area. So the people of Uruk complain to the gods about how harsh Gilgamesh is. And in an effort to sort of straighten Gilgamesh out, they send another fellow, his name is Enkidu, and he is said to be his opposite. So they send Enkidu to kind of be this foil for Gilgamesh. The two go to battle lots of times, and they end up kind of having a draw during one of their battles. They can't beat one another, and so they become best friends. So then the rest of the story is about these adventures that they have together. And the main adventure that happens is Gilgamesh trying to find the elixir of life. And he's looking for this elixir that will allow him to live forever, because midways through the story, Enkidu dies. And when Gilgamesh loses his very best friend, he is distraught, and he also realizes that he too might face death one day and would be powerless in the face of death. So he begins to realize that the part of him that's only 1/3 human might cause him to also meet his ultimate fate one day. So the rest of the story is about him going to find this elixir that will allow him to live forever. He ends up finding the elixir, and it's stolen from him by a serpent in a garden while he is taking a nap. So there's a reference to a serpent in the garden, and we see this reference in Judaism and Christianity as well. And there's also a reference to a flood, an early flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So you can read the entire summary here, but definitely check out this portion of the textbook for this week. This is just an image of tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and tablet 11 is the one that depicts the flood story. And you can kind of see this early form of writing, this cuneiform, where it's just marks and sort of images for each of the words that's being conveyed. This is from tablet 10, and this passage here that's been translated details when Gilgamesh is sort of thinking about his friend Enkidu, who has just died. And so it says, 6 days and 7 nights I mourned over him, would not allow him to be buried until a maggot fell out of his nose. Really graphic stuff here. I was terrified by his appearance. I began to fear death, and so roamed the wilderness. The issue of Enkidu, my friend, oppresses me, so I have been roaming long trails through the wilderness. How can I stay silent? How can I be still? My friend whom I love has turned to clay. Am I not like him? Will I lie down, never to get up again? So after this, Gilgamesh begins to be obsessed with his own impending death and seeks out this elixir. So, in that timeline that I showed earlier, we see all of these transitions between the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, and so forth. And one constant that's remaining at the top of that timeline is the Hebrew civilization. This is a really different civilization. It's a monotheistic religion, so as opposed to polytheistic. So there's a belief in one God in this religion. So the religion here among the Hebrews provides an ethical and moral system that is given by this omnipotent God. This moral system ends up being put down in the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments are the centerpiece of the Torah or the law. So in the Hebrews, we're talking about early Judaism here. And of course, Judaism is one of the oldest monotheistic religions, and Christianity later on is going to become an offshoot of Judaism. So if you're more familiar with the Christian religion and yet these books look familiar to you, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it's because they all make up the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as well. So this religion introduces this idea of ethical monotheism, one God who demands that humans behave in a certain way and rewards and punishes accordingly. So in these polytheistic religions, there was this real sense of the gods being fickle gods, and so the gods would punish and reward for whatever reason, whereas here in this monotheistic religion, it's a very much an individual thing. So things happen to individuals according to their own behaviors and either being rewarded or punished for those. We also see in the Hebrew religion, for the most part, a removal of class distinctions from law. So the law code that's given down by God is a law that applies to everyone equally with the exception of slaves. We'll come back to the Hebrews, we'll come back to Judaism and Christianity in this course, but before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt is the last civilization in chapter 1 that we cover. And this is another river civilization that is set up along the Nile River. So the Nile River is a very predictable river. The flood cycles are extremely predictable. The people who live there know when it's going to flood every year. What's the rainy season? What's the flood season? What's the drought season? And because the Nile River is such a predictable river, it makes the culture here one of the most productive and stable in the entire ancient world. Even as there are different dynasties and different kings and pharaohs, for the most part, the culture stays the same. So for about 3,000 years, a little more than 3,000 years, the culture is unchanged. The system of gods is unchanged. The language, the writing, the depiction in the arts, all of these things remain unchanged. So one of the interesting things about ancient Egypt is that there's a real cyclical understanding of events. There's this idea that there's balance in all things, that with life there's death, with flood there's drought, with abundance there's destruction. So or with creation there's destruction, with abundance there's going without. So there's always this sort of balance, this circle of life, if you will. Early Egyptians are also polytheistic, and this polytheistic religion is also very much tied to nature. So some of the gods that are associated with the Egyptians are Ra, who is born from a mound of silt produced by the Nile. So these are all great examples of creation myths, this myth of where do people come from, where do the gods come from. So Ra is said to be born from a mound of silt. He's associated with the sun, and he's featured here very often with this hawk head and a sun disk on top. The king of Egypt is often depicted as the son of Ra, but can also associate with other gods, specifically Horus. He communicates with gods through temple statues. Osiris, featured here, is the ruler of the underworld. And this story of Osiris is really interesting. He's murdered by Seth, who's the god of storms and violence. So he's murdered by Seth and dismembered, and all of his body parts are thrown into the Nile River. And his wife Isis, who is the goddess of fertility and rebirth, collects all of the pieces and puts them back together to resurrect him. So she's this goddess of fertility or creation. Horus is the son of Osiris and Isis, and he defeats Seth to become the first mythical king. So every king that is derived after Horus is said to have a special relationship with this first king. This is just a depiction of some of the principal Egyptian gods. So again, we have Ra with his bird head and the sun disk. We have Horus featured back here. Here is a depiction of Seth with a jackal. So lots of different gods, and each one of them would be associated with various aspects. The sun, storms and violence, fertility. There's a god of the Nile, all sorts of things. So in terms of what the art looks like, because this culture does remain unchanged for so long, the art really kind of is pretty standard as well. And so some of the things we're going to see in the art that reflects the Egyptian style is this idea of duality, this cycle, this good and evil, destruction and abundance, birth and death, that there's this constant renewal of nature. We'll look at some tombs, most famously, of course, the pyramids of Giza. And tombs are almost always found on the western side of the Nile River. And that's symbolic because the sun sets in the west. And so a burial tomb would be in the region of the Nile where the sun sets. Characteristics that we're going to see in the Egyptian style: when we see figures of humans, which we will, they often face to the right, and they have this composite view. So I'll explain that a little bit better when we look at our first human figure. But what you should know is a composite view is where you have multiple perspectives that's united in one form. So for example, when we're looking at a figure, we might see their shoulders as though we were looking at them face on, and yet their face might be turned in profile view, their feet might be turned in profile view. So it's like you're looking at the front of some of their body parts, but you're looking at the side of other body parts. The monumental royal tomb is known as the pyramid. It is the symbolic embodiment of the king's eternal life. And we'll talk about mummification. So if you've ever seen anything about ancient Egypt, you know that they have mummies. And the mummies are the result of this process of trying to preserve one's ba and ka. So the ba is one's personality, and the ka is their soul. And the idea in ancient Egypt is that after death, the body needs to be preserved because these two elements, the ba and ka, escape the body at death but need to be reunited with the body in the afterlife. So they need to be able to recognize the body. And mummification, this preserving of the body, tries to do just that. Egyptian sculptures, we'll look at some examples of these. And let's start. So the first thing here is the very famous pyramids of Giza. So the pyramids here, you actually see the three major pyramids, the pyramids of Menkaure, Khafra, and Khufu. And then these smaller ones would be part of the entire complex. So there's a big, huge complex where these pyramids are, lots of smaller pyramids around. And it's because many people of their royal courts, wives, attendants would also be buried in this complex as well. So basically, a person would be, or not any person, but royalty would be buried with all of the things that they needed in the afterlife. So gold, rich clothing, food, but also attendants as well. I really encourage you to look up what you can about the construction of the pyramids. This is really a feat of great modern architecture, and yet it's done, back in 2500 BCE. So amazing the amount of time that they believe that it took, which was not very long. The size of each one of the blocks that would have made up this pyramid. There was all sorts of theories about how these were constructed. Really some interesting stuff. Don't get too sucked into conspiracy theories because there's lots of those as well. And a lot of times when people can't figure out how things were done, they go to myths. They tell themselves stories about how they were done. So there's lots of things out there about aliens making the pyramids, but try not to get too sucked into that stuff. So here's a cutaway of one of the pyramids. This is the pyramid of Khufu. And so very often these pyramids would have these air chambers here. And for the most part, these are thought to be, and this is the actual burial chamber. These are thought to be places where the Ba and the Ka could escape after death, but also return back to the body when they needed to. This one has a couple of trick chambers, which was pretty common. So these pyramids get looted like crazy because everyone knows that kings get buried with all their jewels and their dinnerware and food and all kinds of things. So looters rob burial tombs on the regular. And so they get smart about this and begin to make some false entrances here and there to kind of lead them astray. Here's a really good aerial view of this entire burial structure. So we've got, again, these three pyramids, and they're all kind of lined up mathematically. So we've got the pyramid of Khafra, Khufu, and Menkaure. These are the smaller pyramids to the queens. There's a temple out in front. Khafra's has the Great Sphinx, which we're going to look at in just a second. But there's also other smaller pyramids over here, boat pits, all sorts of things that you would find within this burial structure. Here's the Great Sphinx, and this is the pyramid of Khafra in the background. So this is the Egyptian style. This is the largest statue of the ancient world, and likely there was a large limestone knoll right out here in front of Khafra's pyramid, and that was carved away to make this sphinx, which has got the head of a man and the body of a lion. This is likely a depiction, or meant to be a depiction of Khafra's head, because this structure stands right in front of this greatest pyramid as sort of keeping watch over. Here is a rare painting that exists from the Egyptian period. This is Nebamam hunting birds. Nebamam was one of the kings of Egypt, and this is located in his tomb. So this is a fresco. A fresco secco is a fresh fresco where paint would be applied to the surface of the wall, the plaster of the walls around it. So we've got a series of hieroglyphs here in the background, but featured centrally here is Nebamam hunting a variety of birds, and this scene takes place along the Nile. So you can see the abundance of plant life, of animal life, all the different species of birds that you see here. There's a cat. And then also down below, all of the fish life that you see here. This is the wife of Nebamam standing behind him, and then this is believed to be his young daughter beneath. So this work is said to be related also to sexual procreation. One, because you've got the daughter who's down here below, but also just this idea of the constant renewal and abundance of life. So the stick here that he holds has the shape of a snake and all of these things. And of course, it also has a phallic kind of representation to it as well. And all of these things kind of play into this scene of abundance. There's abundance and life here in this painting, and ironically is featured in his burial tomb. Oh, let me go back to show you the composite view I was talking about. So this is a really good example of the composite view. So what we often see, and this is an unusual because the head is to the left and typically it's to the right, but we often see a face that's in profile, but the eye here on the side is straightforward. So this is what the eye would look like if you were looking directly into the face of the person. The shoulders are also sort of this frontal view, so they're very wide here, but the abdomen is sort of at a 3/4 turn, so we can see most of the navel on the other side. The hips are in profile view, the knees are at a 3/4 turn, the feet are in profile view. So it's sort of this mixing of different perspectives here. Here we have Menkaure. So Menkaure is one of the kings that has the pyramids at Giza. And this is him with one of his queens. This was found at the Valley Temple of Menkaure. So not in the pyramid itself, but in a temple that was located near the burial structure. This is made out of schist, which is a really durable material, which is why it still exists today. And we can tell a lot from this composition. One, we can tell something about the style of clothing and headdress that they wear. But also we can tell quite a bit about the relationship between man and wife in this composition, where this woman is on the same height nearly as Menkaure, and she uses one arm to kind of restrain him and the other hugs around his backside. So she's providing a sort of support for her husband, but he steps forward with his leg, and so he appears as the more dominant of the two in this composition. But she's there as a support and nearly an equal standing. I want to just show you this as contrast because very much so in Egyptian society, the material of the sculpture kind of lets us know something about the status of the individual who's depicted. So when we're depicting a king, we use a very durable material like schist. When we're depicting someone like a scribe, a writer, this is an important role in society, but not on the level of being a king. There's a less durable material that's used. So in this case, limestone is used and it's painted over, as you can see. You also might notice that the body here is much different than the body of Menkaure that we see here. So Menkaure has this very athletic, stern-looking body. His face is naturalistic and soft, but the body is very rigid. He looks like he works out. Whereas here, the seated scribe has a soft belly, sagging pecs here, a little bit of flabbiness to the arms. His cheeks are a little more sunken. So this is probably a little more realistic view. And then here's a really great example of this composite view. This is a palette of Narmer. So a palette, this is thought to be, this is two-sided as well. This is thought to be like a little decorative plate that perhaps this circle right here would have held or would have been a space to grind up pigments that were used for eye makeup. Because if you couldn't tell here, there is sort of this emphasis on using paints on the face, especially around the region of the eyes. So the palette of Narmer was thought to perhaps be kind of this commemorative palette about that. It also uses some of the same things that we've seen before, like hieroglyphs. So this is using hieroglyphs up here in particular. there's like this catfish and this stick, and those two hieroglyphs put together make up the name Narmer, who lets us know who this figure is. But it also uses things like the ground line that Narmer is standing on and registers. So it has a lower register down here and a middle register where most of the action is happening, and then these upper registers here. So take a close look. This is in a pull-out section of your textbook that is called A Closer Look, and it really kind of works through what each part of the sculpture here references. And this is a really good example of a relief sculpture. So, and this is in low relief. You can see how the bodies are kind of carved out from the back of this object here. So take a look at that. Notice this one has 4 registers in it. And very much, this is a scene of war. So you've got these decapitated figures here. But I won't spoil it. You take a look at this. Make sure that you're noting things like the low relief, the composite view of the figures, and the registers here. The Rosetta Stone. So this is a key piece of understanding Egyptian history. So for a long time, people do not understand these hieroglyphs and what they mean, these little images. They're very different from the cuneiform that exists in Mesopotamia. But around 196 BCE, there is this decree that goes out by Ptolemy V, and this is recorded in 3 different languages. So just as Hammurabi makes that stele that sends out his law code to everybody so everyone's on the same page about what the laws are, this is something similar. Ptolemy is Greek, and he also puts together this decree to let everybody know what's up. Well, by this time, the Greeks had kind of spread into this area. And so there are people living in the area who speak and write in Greek. They speak and write in Demotic Egyptian, which is more of a spoken form of Egyptian. And they also still write in the hieroglyphs. And so in order to make sure everybody can read this and understand the rules, they composed this decree in all 3 languages. So this was later discovered in 1799 by Napoleon's army, Napoleon of France, and during their military campaign to Egypt. And once this is discovered in 1799, they realized that they have a key to interpreting the hieroglyphics. So that wasn't discovered. People weren't able to read those hieroglyphs for a really long time, not until nearly 1800. So only for about 200 years have we been able to read the hieroglyphs. So the way that they do this is they know what this says in Greek, and so they're able to piece together what this would say in the hieroglyphs. So just the exact same way you would do any kind of translation today. All right, and to get ready to wrap up the chapter finally, we're going to look at this sculpture of a different pharaoh, and this is Akhenaten. So the Egyptians are polytheistic for the most part, and there's one exception to that. So Akhenaten was previously known as Amenhotep, and Amenhotep comes to power as a king, and he abolishes polytheism and instead worships a single god called Aten. And Aten is represented here by the sun disk. And he changes his name to Akhenaten, son of Aten, to sort of show his allegiance to this single god. So banishes all of the other gods. Everyone believes in the one god for now. And the art changes during this period as well. So this is known as the Amarna period. And during the Amarna period, we begin to see the king depicted in more of a relaxed setting. So here we have Akhenaten and his family. This is his wife Nefertiti, and their 3 children. So who look a little odd because of the headdresses that they're wearing, and they look just like little miniature people. But you can notice here things like the sagging belly, the little belly rolls, the skinny arms, the rolls in the neck here. So this is much more of a naturalistic depiction of the family here than what we saw, for example, with the scene of Menkaure and his wife, where they look really, really physically fit. This is also a good example of a different kind of relief sculpture, which is reverse relief. So now instead of having the images, or like instead of having the background cut away so that the images come forward, instead you have the images kind of carved backwards into the stone back here along with all of the hieroglyphs. This is just a bust of Nefertiti. This was painted limestone, so you can see the colors that were used, the amount of makeup that she has, this really elaborate headdress, which was really common during the day. And then finally, we have this funerary mask of Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun's tomb, or King Tut, was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, another English archaeologist. And this was one of the only royal burial tombs that had not been looted. And so it's discovered with the mummy of King Tut, as well as lots and lots of treasures such as this. So this was the funerary mask. It was in a sarcophagus, or like a large coffin that held the mummified body of King Tut, and this would have been overlaid on top of King Tut. So lots of design elements here. This gold structure that's inlaid with lots of precious glass and semi-precious stones. But lots of great detail here in terms of not only the carving, but also the style of the neckwear and the headdress and this wrapped beard as well. This is the back of King Tut's golden throne. So you can see here, after Akhenaten, for a while, people go back to, they followed this monotheistic religion for a little while, but then they go right back to their polytheistic religion. But notice that the style sticks around, because King Tut here has the same kind of relaxed Amarna style that we saw with Akhenaten. And there's also this reference to the sun disk here as well. And he's featured here with his wife as well. So very much the artist of this chair where this is inscribed on the back definitely would have known this earlier work of Akhenaten, because there's lots of references here. And so in closing with this chapter, the next civilization that we're going to look at is the Greek civilization in chapter 2. And we'll come back to this slide again. But I want you to just kind of get a little preview of, this is sort of our standard sculpture in ancient Egypt. Very stiff, very noble. And then once we move into the Greek period, this is going to be early Greek, or the archaic period. We have this same kind of stance with one foot forward, but we begin to see more details in the body. So the skin begins to look softer, the face looks more relaxed, we see more details in the abdomen. And when we get finally to the classical Greek period, notice the realism here. So we see lots of anatomical detail, and we're going to be introduced to this new way of standing. No one really stands like this, right? When you're standing around talking to a group of friends, you don't really stand upright with perfect posture like this. Most people stand like this, and we're going to call this contrapposto. We're going to talk about it when we get to chapter 2. So that's it for chapter 1. This was a long narration. Remember that this is one way of viewing the slides. You're welcome to go through this on your own, but if you like to kind of hear what I think is important for each of the chapters, feel free to tag along with me for these very long narrations. Until next week.